This is Eric Falkenstein, author of The Missing Risk Premium, Why Low Volatility Investing Works. Here are the key ideas in this book. The risk premium is supposedly omnipresent and very important because every asset has an expected return, and this expected return is a risk-free rate plus this risk premium. So in economic modeling and, of course, in investing, you have this risk premium. It can also be thought of as a discount rate because current prices are just the future prices or future values discounted by this expected return. I go over the derivation of the basic model of risk and return and its extensions because it's important to understand something when criticizing it. Now, the basic model, you have risk, here beta is in the CAPM, which is a function of covariances with something like the stock market. And the expected return increases linearly in this risk metric. And this generalizes to other models that have more than one risk factor. Obviously, for asset allocation, if this were true, it would be very important. I survey 25 asset classes and show that to a first approximation, there's a zero risk premium. That is the long end of the yield curve. Or when you go from triple B to single B in corporate bond ratings, you don't find a higher return to these intuitively riskier assets. Indeed, you often find a negative risk premium. Not just in sports betting, where the 100-to-1 horse has a lower expected return, but that makes sense because you're having fun. And within equity markets, higher betas, higher volatility, higher financial distress are all correlated with lower returns. Now, there are exceptions to this rule. The short end of the yield curve, the short end of the credit curve, and the efficient equity investor who invests in something like the Vanguard 500 do appear to capture a risk premium, and I discuss those in depth. The utility function is key. One's utility in this standard function is solely a function of one's own wealth, increasing at a decreasing rate. This standard utility function is both a necessary and sufficient condition for risk premium. This means the absence of one implies the absence of the other. I argue a better description of utility is that it's relatively oriented, and in this case, risk is symmetric and therefore not priced. The gist of this idea is best exemplified by this simple table, where you have two assets, X and Y, and you can see that X is traditionally the less risky asset because it has a lower volatility, 20 points versus 40 points. But in relative space, you see they have the exact same volatility, and both are under or outperforming 5, just in different states. This basic idea underlies academic work by people like Gali, DeMarzo, Candle, and Kramer, and Rusinoff. But what they do is to apply this parochially. I just say you should apply this to everyone, and then there is no risk premium. There's a lot of independent validation for the relative utility function over the absolute model. A relative utility function is much more robust than the standard utility function. Anthropologists note that envy is a human universal, whereas simple greed is not. Economists have surveyed people and found that happiness is more a function of relative rather than absolute wealth. For example, consider a world where you make $120,000, everyone else makes $200,000, or one where you make $110,000, everyone else makes $90,000. Most people prefer the poor world where they are relatively wealthy. These preferences show up in our brains. Neurologists have found there are specific parts of the brain that process social context. While theoretically a relative utility function implies there should be zero correlation between risk and return, often we see a negative correlation. I'll go over the reasons why many people like highly volatile assets. I also show how, in a relative utility model, these preferences can manifest themselves in asset prices without ad hoc constraints. One simple takeaway is that you should invest in low volatility assets within any domain. That is, you can reduce your volatility in equities by 30 to 40% simply by focusing on the low volatility components without sacrificing returns. Indeed, often you see a lift in the returns relative to the benchmarks that they are compared against. For example, if I look in the US and I segregate stocks into those close to 1/2, beta of 1, beta of 1.5, you find that the high beta stocks have a lower return over time. This is data from 62. So you get a lower return. The difference between low and medium beta, low and medium risk, is usually not very large in return space. But in volatility space, it still suggests you should prefer the low volatility asset. However, the high volatility assets are doubly bad because they not only have really high variance, but they actually have significantly lower returns. The truth on something as profound as what people maximize has many implications. Don't expect to be rewarded for risk-taking per se. So when you invest, find a parochial edge and avoid intuitively risky assets unrelated to that edge. Derivative pricing is very successful because it's focused simply on arbitrage and ignores risk premiums completely for reasons outside this model. I think part of the reason why it's so successful is that it focuses on payoffs and probabilities and arbitrage relationships, which is quite fruitful. Risk premiums are a red herring. Just as the opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference, the opposite of risk-taking is not doing nothing. It's not cash. It's doing what everyone else is doing. The current standard theory remains a useful normative model of how to invest. I think a Sharpe ratio is a good thing to maximize. It's important to recognize that this isn't reality, however. It doesn't describe how people actually invest. Anyway, there's more in the book, and I hope you take a look.